Okay, History 103. This is video number 2 from week 12. You're going to see 2 videos that are posted because I had a technical snafu and I don't want to go back and re-discuss the first 15 minutes of the video that I'd begun. So I'm going to pick up again with the early American economy. And I was right in the middle of talking about the market revolution, so I'm just going to pick up on that. So I hope that when I post video 1, you'll be able to see that video 2 will be linked next to it. I'll say video 1 of 2 and then video 2 of 2 so that you know to watch 1 and then 2. So this is number 2. Sorry about that, but this market revolution I was in the middle of saying had both positive and negative effects. I described just a second ago, before I was rudely interrupted, a positive effect, which was that it provided farm families in particular with greater access to consumer goods. A negative effect is that because families shifted from subsistence to market dependence, depending on selling their crops on external markets, in times of economic depression, farm families often found themselves completely unable to feed themselves. When they couldn't sell their crops, when they couldn't pay the mortgages on their farms, they were often dispossessed of their land, had to declare bankruptcy, and found it difficult to support themselves. So this capitalist transformation, this shift that I just described, was both positive and negative. But on the back of this capitalist transformation of the countryside, we have the second revolution, which could only have emerged with the market revolution, which is called the Industrial Revolution. And I think this is a term that's probably familiar to many of you. Typically, we learn about the Industrial Revolution in either world civilization classes, or if we've taken European history before, we learn about, most importantly, the British Industrial Revolution, which occurred over the course of the 18th century. Here we're discussing the American Industrial Revolution, which really began to take hold at the very end of the 18th century, but began to skyrocket in the early decades of the 19th century. And this Industrial Revolution was a revolution in technology, labor-saving technology, which allowed burgeoning factories to produce consumer goods much more efficiently and at a much larger scale. So most importantly, in the United States, as was the case in Great Britain, the Industrial Revolution began with textile manufacturing, technological advancements that made it much more efficient to produce cloths in order to make clothes. That also includes, for example, shoe manufacturing, which you see on your slide too. So we see the first modern textile factories in America begin to pop up in Rhode Island in 1789 and 1790. In Lowell, Massachusetts, and you don't have a date there, you need to fix that. In 1820, we begin to see the first modern shoe manufacturing facilities, again in Lowell, Massachusetts. These modern factories really began to transform the northern economies because they drew more and more people from farms in the countryside to work as wage laborers in growing factory facilities. And of course, as we know, wage labor is a labor system in which a person sells their labor for a particular amount of money, but in which they don't own what are called means of production, the machines, right, that make the cloth or that make the shoes. This is called industrial capitalism, and capitalist people who invest in factories purchase machines and simply hire workers to serve as wage laborers. So this Industrial Revolution also had a major impact on the individual and collective day-to-day lives of American workers. And like the market revolution, the Industrial Revolution had both positive and negative outcomes. A positive outcome is that the textile and shoe factories made consumer goods more widely available. Textile and shoes were able to over time, by the 1820s and 1830s, made mass-produced cloths and shoes more widely available, in addition to other consumer goods, but textiles and shoes are the most important ones. But at the same time, industrial wage laborers often experienced negative outcomes from the shift to industrialization. They were often paid low wages. 12-hour work days were common. Work conditions were barbaric by our modern standards. industrial accidents were common. There was no such thing as unemployment insurance, for example. So a capitalist factory owner could choose to fire or lay off workers whenever they wanted, and owed no severance or unemployment to those that they laid off. So the day-to-day life of the industrial worker was often quite miserable. And we can read in more detail in American Yawp Chapter 8 about the young women who worked in the Lowell shoe factories, and it was often a pretty bleak and lonely existence. So again, like the market revolution, we wouldn't want to describe the Industrial Revolution as an entirely positive development, but it did begin to transform the northern economy, so that by the period of the Civil War, the 1860s, we see the northern states of the United States becoming on the path to becoming an industrial powerhouse. The third revolution I want to discuss here, the transportation revolution, emerged itself on the back of the market and industrial revolutions. And this transportation revolution was significant because it engendered what at the time were called internal improvements. Today we would call these infrastructure development. In order to distribute goods made by wage laborers in factories as a result of the Industrial Revolution, in order to allow more efficient movement of farm goods, right, made for external or produced for external markets, a hallmark of the market revolution, we begin to see infrastructure development in especially the free states of the North. And this really begins to rise in the 1820s and 1830s. First, we have canals, for example, the Erie Canal, human-made waterways that allowed the movement of goods overland long distances to be done far more efficiently and quickly. And of course, railroads by the 1830s. Railroads need no introduction, but certainly allowing the movement of goods and people to occur overland far more quickly than had been possible before. So these three connected revolutions, the Industrial Revolution, the Transportation Revolution, and the Market Revolution, as I said, had transformative effects on the free states of the North, but especially in New England, states like New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, but at the same time had both positive and negative outcomes. So I'll stop there for a second, and now I'm going to transition and talk about the rise of American democracy. So if you go to Blackboard and you go to the information tab, you can find, and go ahead and pull it up quickly, the Rise of American Democracy PowerPoint, so you can follow along with me. So I'll pause here for 1 second, and I'll give you an opportunity to do that, and then we will continue. Okay, so if you don't have it up yet, just pause for a second. But I'm going to continue now with, again, this PowerPoint slide called The Rise of American Democracy. So this PowerPoint slide corresponds to Chapter 9 of American Yawp. And I don't know if I'll get through all of it today, but I just want to get through the first couple of slides so that we can have a sense for what this political movement, this rise of democracy was, and the impact that it had on the American people. Excuse me. So if you if you go down to the first slide with text, so go and skip past that map, and we'll come back and talk about that in a second. We want to define this rise in American democratic political participation. And this slide is called Defining Jacksonian Democracy because this rise that we're discussing on this particular slide is most closely associated with Andrew Jackson. Eventually a president of the United States, but of all figures of the early 19th century, the person who's so closely associated with this rise of democratic political participation that historians often refer to this movement as the Jacksonian democracy. So that's why I'm calling this Defining the Jacksonian Democracy. Because he, as an individual, came to be the embodiment, if you will, of this movement. So what I have on this slide is the sort of background developments that by the 1820s, as we'll see, would lead to both the rise of Andrew Jackson to the presidency, but a major shift in political participation. And the key to understanding this is that over the first several decades of the 19th century, let's say after 1800, just to put a sort of round figure on it, a round number on it, what begins to happen in the individual states, at this time, individual states determined voting requirements rather than, as is the case today, the national government. The individual states began to first lower and then eventually abolish pre-existing property requirements for white men. Now, if you remember back to our discussion of the immediate post-revolutionary period, one of the things that we noted was that in the 1780s, 1790s, every state had requirements that white men, in order to be able to vote, must own a certain amount of property. These requirements eventually were lowered for white men and, as I said, abolished by the year 1820. And this creates a new kind of political system that political scientists, you see that italicized word there, call a Herrenvolk democracy, which is a term that describes a political system which is democratic, but for one particular group in a given society, so that there is widespread voting and political participation, but only for one group in that society. And in this case, in the United States, that is for white men. For non-white men and for all women, regardless of their color, we see, getting down to this second point, race, democracy, and disenfranchisement, that the rise of American democracy excluded non-white men and all women. So black men in states like New York, for example, had actually been able to vote before the year 1821, in the case of New York, if they owned a certain amount of property, the same as white men. So as this expansion of suffrage occurs for white men, we see the disenfranchisement, the exclusion of non-white men. And so that's the hallmark of the rise of American democracy. It's an exclusive political movement which empowered all white men, regardless of their wealth or education level, and excluded all non-white men and all women, as I said, regardless of their racial or economic background. So in 1821, what we see is property qualifications raised to prohibitive levels for black men by a new constitution for New York State ratified in that year, and simultaneously property requirements for white men in New York completely erased down to zero. So the poorest white man can vote, and almost every black man in New York who previously could vote before 1821 was disenfranchised. So this rise of American democracy, again, is Herrenvolk democracy, in which one group of people, white men, directly benefit, while everybody else in American society, in our case, is excluded. And this is obviously, I think it's pretty clear to say that we would call this political movement a racist political movement, and it certainly was. But it did pave the way for wider political participation. We see the numbers of votes in presidential elections begin to rise. Why? Because we see more and more white men who are newly able to vote. And this began to have an impact on presidential elections in the 1820s. So if we scroll down to the elections of 1824 and 1828, just want to describe them briefly. This is when we begin to see newly enfranchised, poor and uneducated white men, often illiterate white men, really beginning to have an impact on national elections. In the election of 1824, we have a unique four-way election. Andrew Jackson is one candidate. Andrew Jackson from Tennessee, which is TN, was born himself impoverished slightly before the American Revolution, and according to his own story, worked his way up the ranks of society to become a man of power and wealth. So he always considered himself to be a quote-unquote common man, and as a political candidate, that's how he presented himself. Although by the 1820s, he was very wealthy as a plantation owner, and as a lawyer and politician. But he never let voters forget that he had come from an impoverished background, and he used that to his advantage. And I'll talk a little bit more about his political strategies and his political philosophy on the next slide. But the second candidate, J.Q. Adams, which stands for John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams from Massachusetts, MA, was the son of John Adams, the second president. So very much the opposite of the so-called common man. He was born into the political elite. Of course, his father was the second president. John Quincy Adams represented the elite interests of New England, right, Massachusetts. Third candidate, Henry Clay from Kentucky, an interesting figure, and he's one that we're going to return to. Henry Clay was an opponent of Andrew Jackson, although he too was a slave owner, but he would become the leader of a political party that emerged in the 1830s called the Whig Party, W-H-I-G. You'll see that on a subsequent slide, so no need to write that down now or to remember that specifically now. Henry Clay became identified with the interests of the so-called West, of which Kentucky was the western portion of the United States at the time. And the final candidate, who I will not talk at all about, just so you know he existed, named William Crawford from Georgia. This election was unique, again, as a four-way election. If you slide down to the next slide, you can see the electoral college map there, and you can see that each candidate won electoral college votes. But if you go down to the bottom, you can see that Andrew Jackson won both the popular vote. If you look on the very right there, 43%, so 153,000 votes, and 199 electoral college votes, all of this pink salmon color states, which was good for 38% of the vote. John Quincy Adams came in second, and you can see the statistics, winning all of the New England states primarily. And this vote was unique because, as per the Constitution, in order to win an election, a candidate must win at least 50.1%, a majority, of the electoral college votes. As you can see, Andrew Jackson had the most electoral college votes, a plurality, but not 50%. And so Congress decided the outcome of this election, and it chose John Quincy Adams. Andrew Jackson's supporters immediately claimed that this was a quote-unquote corrupt bargain, that John Quincy Adams and, in fact, Henry Clay, the third candidate there, struck a deal to prevent Andrew Jackson from winning the presidency. And so Adams wins and becomes president. But in the meantime, Andrew Jackson and his campaign manager, is the term we would use today, Martin Van Buren, you see his name under the election 28, began to plan for the upcoming election of 1828 an attempt to win the presidency for Andrew Jackson. And so in between the elections of 1824 and 1828, what Martin Van Buren and Andrew Jackson effectively did was create a new political party to promote the interests of the so-called white common man. And this was called the Democratic Party. So even the name is a suggestion that this is closely related to this rise of democracy that we just defined on the previous slide. And this is the Democratic Party that continues to exist today. It was founded in the 1820s as, ironically, and very ironically, a political party which promoted the ideas of white male supremacy. It was closely identified with Andrew Jackson, this rise of American democracy for white men, and the disenfranchisement of people of color. So again, initially, this party its views are very much the opposite of what we would associate it with today. It was founded as a white male supremacist party, primarily finding its base of power in the southern states, which is very much the opposite, as many of you know today. So this party was created, again, to promote Andrew Jackson, but through Andrew Jackson, the interests of non-elite white men. And it had a platform that argued very strongly in favor of what were called states' rights. The Democratic Party, again, very much unlike today, was founded on the idea that the national government should be as limited, as weak as possible, and that the individual states and localities should therefore have more control over their affairs rather than being subjected to a national government interfering with local conditions. So they really contrasted a nationalist view and somebody like John Quincy Adams, for example, very much a nationalist, with a states' rights view. And this turned out to be an effective pitch, okay, contrasting nationalism and states' rights, emphasizing the rights of so-called common white men versus elites and people of color. And this resulted in Andrew Jackson winning a landslide election. And actually, if you scroll down to below the map of 1824, the next image is a campaign poster from Andrew Jackson's 1828 campaign. And you can see these themes on this poster. You can see Andrew Jackson being promoted as a man of the people. If you look at the third line, and the people, by the way, meant common white men, non-elite white men. And you see that phrase repeated several times. Jackson's a man of the people. He cannot barter or bargain for the presidency, a reference to the so-called corrupt bargain of 1824. Power should be derived from the people. So you can really get a sense for the themes which Andrew Jackson's and the Democratic Party initially emphasized in 1828. And if you scroll down farther to the electoral map of 1828, I think it's clear that this was a landslide election. All of the states that are shaded green, all the way up to New York State. If you look at the 20 electoral college votes from eastern New York State, and even Maine, way up at the top right, one electoral college vote. Andrew Jackson's winning more than 2/3 in 1828 of the electoral college votes, whereas John Quincy Adams, running for re-election, fared very poorly, winning only 32%, primarily in New England and in Western New York. So you can see that this white male supremacist political party, aka the Democratic Party, was effective among American voters who were white men. And so this swept Andrew Jackson into power in 1828, cementing the rise of the Democratic Party. So what I want to do now is talk about the next slide, and I think I'll stop there for today and then pick up this subject next week. Because I have to figure out how to upload 2 videos at the same time since I was so rudely interrupted by technology. But I want to talk about the politics, as you can see the title of the subsequent slide, the slide after the election map from 1828. Where is it? There it is. The politics of the Jacksonian democracy, how Jackson and the Democratic Party made political appeals to their constituents. And the first term is populism. And it's a political strategy. It's a political, it's a version of politics that continues to exist today, all the way down to the current president of the United States. And it was populism, in many ways, was the hallmark of Jackson and Martin Van Buren. Again, his, we would call campaign manager's political strategy. And so what populism is a term that describes a political strategy in which a candidate or a party, so in this case, Andrew Jackson and the Democratic Party, make a political appeal to the common people, which is why I have that in quotations, in this case, non-elite white men. And the basic political message is that the people are being unfairly corrupted by some elite. And so populism is a common political strategy over the course of the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. It can be applied to a lot of different contexts. There can be conservative populists, there can be radical leftist populists, but populism, simply put, is a political message that claims the people, and usually that is meant to be non-elite people, are being corrupted by some elite. The issues change over time in different contexts, different countries. But populism also is often very effective as a vote-gathering strategy. And it's certainly what Andrew Jackson and the Democratic Party centered their political messaging on. In the case of Andrew Jackson, the elite was primarily located in the Northeast, and they were primarily identified, and you can see this quickly if you scroll down to the next slide, with the Bank of the United States, what Andrew Jackson and his followers called the money power. It was their two-word phrase to describe the small number of elite, wealthy bankers and financiers who lived in cities like New York and Pennsylvania, who controlled the national bank, the Bank of the United States, who they believed were using their control of the national bank to oppress common, in this case, common white men, non-elite people. So there's an economic element to the Jacksonian populist message, and there often is in other contexts that a country's economic system is being tilted unfairly in the favor of a very small number of elites. That's true in this period, in the context of the Bank of the United States. And as you can see on that subsequent slide, Andrew Jackson made it a campaign promise to attack the money power in a series of events called the Bank War, Andrew Jackson's fight to destroy the Bank of the United States, which he and his followers believed to be the literal but also symbolic center of power for the money power. And as you can see on that slide, ultimately, Andrew Jackson was successful in vetoing the Bank of the United States recharter in 1832 and dismantling the bank, therefore, for the last time in American history, dismantling the national bank. We still don't have a national bank. We have a Federal Reserve System, but not a nationalized bank. Another area in which we see this populist message developed, there we go, by Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren, is in attacking government elites, which is the second point on the slide entitled The Politics of the Jacksonian Democracy. And this they attacked through something called a spoil system. Andrew Jackson and his followers before 1828 came to believe that the United States government was unfairly in control of what today we would call an entrenched government bureaucracy, government officials, especially in the postal system, primarily appointed by political opponents, previous political opponents of Andrew Jackson and the Democratic Party, who Jacksonians believed were using their positions in the United States government unfairly to discriminate against common white men, non-elite white men. And so Andrew Jackson promised in 1828 that if he were elected, he would wipe out the government bureaucracy and replace it with his own followers. This is called the spoils system. To the victor goes the spoils, the famous quote. Andrew Jackson said, "If I win, I will use my election as a mandate to replace the government bureaucracy with true democratic, non-elite men." And so that's what he did. And you can see that on the image just below this slide. It's a political cartoon that is criticizing this so-called spoil system. So if you look at the patronage mill, you can see it's labeled on the top right. Below it, it says spoil system. And this is a criticism where we can see typical caricatures of Andrew Jackson's followers. If you see, they're all white men. Some of them are dressed kind of raggedly. There are some who are military officers, including the man on the far left in the blue. Blue was the color of the United States Army. And you can see in the back, if you see two men who have hats on, it's Texas Small, let's say Platt and Dudley. These were caricatures of sort of average run-of-the-mill slaveholders, which is denoted by the fact that they're carrying whips. You can see most of the people in this background picture are carrying whips, which is meant to tell the viewer that they are slaveholders. And they're forcing Uncle Sam, who you can see there is pushing the patronage mill, to crank out offices and jobs for them, which you can see if you look at the water flowing out of the mill. It says offices, political workers, offices for spoilsmen. So this is, again, a criticism, but it's accurate in that this is very much a direct part of Andrew Jackson's appeal to white men. And this bleeds into, finally, the last point, which I've already suggested, is that this Democratic Party, this new Democratic Party, in addition to having a populist appeal through attacking the Bank of the United States, promoting the spoil system, finally had a core belief of defending the interests of slaveholders. And their political strategy was to take control of the federal government so that they could promote the individual states' rights to protect slavery. That's a hallmark of the Democratic Party as well, especially under Andrew Jackson, who himself was a large-scale slaveholder. And what we'll see, and you can read this in Chapter 9 of American Yop as well, and I'll pick this up a little bit at the beginning of next week's video lecture, is that much of the policies that, many of the policies that were pursued by Jacksonian Democrats were pursued because they would promote and protect the interests of slaveholders. And so what we'll, begin talking about at the beginning of the next video lecture is that priority of protecting the interests of slaveholders, specifically with Native American policy and the so-called Trail of Tears. And so I'll get back to that at the beginning of next week. So I'm going to stop there. So as I said at the beginning, first of all, I hope you're all well. I have received most of your midterm examinations, the vast majority of them. If you haven't, get in touch. If you haven't turned it in, get in touch with me so that you can. I will grade those this week, hoping to post the grades on Wednesday. Today is Wednesday. And moving forward, we have a regular week next week. But on Wednesday, I will post a discussion board response, and I'll email you to let you know that I've done that. And I think that's all I have to say. So have a good week, and I will be back in touch with you on Wednesday through the discussion board. And okay, have a good one.